Maria Elena lived in a small mountain village where everyone knew everyone else's business. She was 23 years old, with long dark hair and green eyes that seemed to hold ancient wisdom. The villagers whispered about her because she was different. While other young women her age were married with children, Maria spent her days collecting herbs in the forest and helping sick animals recover. Her grandmother had taught her about plants and their healing powers before she died. Maria knew which leaves could stop a fever, which roots could ease pain, and which flowers could help wounds heal faster. But in 1692, in the remote village of San Miguel, people feared what they didn't understand. The trouble started when the blacksmith's wife fell ill with a strange sickness. Her skin turned yellow and she couldn't keep food down. The village priest tried to pray over her, but nothing worked. Desperate, the blacksmith came to Maria's small cottage at the edge of her town. He begged her to help his dying wife. Maria brewed a tea from herbs she had dried in her attic. She mixed yellow dockroot for the liver, ginger for the stomach, and chamomile to help the woman rest. She gave careful instructions about how much to give and when. Within 3 days, the blacksmith's wife was sitting up in bed, eating soup, and laughing with her children. But instead of gratitude, fear spread through the village like wildfire. How could a young unmarried woman succeed where the priest had failed? The village elders gathered in the town square, their faces grim and suspicious. Old superstitions came rushing back to life. Father Rodriguez, the village priest, stood before the crowd with his black robes flapping in the mountain wind. His voice carried across the square as he spoke of evil forces and dark magic. He pointed toward Maria's cottage, where smoke from her cooking fire curled into the gray sky. The crowd grew larger as more people came to listen. Fear makes people do terrible things, and soon voices were raised in anger. Someone shouted that Maria must have made a deal with the devil. Another person claimed they had seen strange lights coming from her windows at night. These were lies, but in their fear, the villagers wanted someone to blame for all their troubles. Maria had no idea what was happening in the town square. She was in her garden, carefully tending to the medicinal plants her grandmother had taught her to grow. The late afternoon sun felt warm on her back as she pulled weeds from around the healing mint. She hummed an old song her grandmother used to sing, feeling peaceful and content. When she heard the angry voices approaching her cottage, Maria looked up from her garden with confusion. A mob of 30 villagers marched toward her home, led by Father Rodriguez and the village mayor. Their faces were twisted with fear and hatred. Some carried torches even though it was still daylight. Others held farming tools like weapons. Maria stood slowly, dirt still on her hands from gardening. She tried to smile and greet them, but her voice caught in her throat when she saw their expressions. These people had known her since she was a child. She had helped many of them when they were sick or injured. Why were they looking at her like she was a monster? Father Rodriguez stepped forward, his voice booming with authority. He accused Maria of practicing witchcraft and making a pact with Satan. The crowd behind him nodded and murmured their agreement. Maria felt the world spinning around her as she realized what was happening. In those days, being called a witch was a death sentence. She tried to explain that she only used plants to help people, just as her grandmother had taught her. She showed them her garden, pointing out common herbs that many villagers used for cooking. But fear had already taken hold of their hearts. They refused to listen to reason. The mayor, a heavy man with a gray beard, declared that Maria must leave the village immediately or face trial for witchcraft. A trial in those days meant torture and death. Maria's hands shook as she realized she had no choice. She could stay and die or leave everything she had ever known behind. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, Maria packed a small bag with her few possessions. She took her grandmother's herb book, some dried medicines, a warm cloak, and what little money she had saved. The villagers watched in silence as she prepared to leave the only home she had ever known. With tears in her eyes, Maria walked away from her cottage, her garden, and her old life. She didn't look back because she knew it would break her heart, completely. Behind her, she could hear the villagers arguing about who would take over her small plot of land. The mountain path was dark and dangerous at night, but Maria had no choice but to keep walking. Wild animals howled in the distance and the cold wind cut through her cloak. She was alone in the world, with nowhere to go and no one to turn to. The villagers had cast her out as a witch, and now she had to find a way to survive in a world that feared and hated her. Maria walked through the night, her feet bleeding in her worn shoes. The mountain path was rocky and steep, and several times she stumbled and almost fell into the deep ravines below. When the first light of dawn appeared, she found herself in a valley she had never seen before. Her throat was dry, her stomach empty, and her body ached from the cold. She followed the sound of running water until she found a small stream. Kneeling by the water's edge, Maria cupped her hands and drank deeply. The water was ice cold and tasted of snow from the high peaks. She splashed some on her face, washing away the tears and dirt from her terrible journey. Looking around, Maria saw that she was in a beautiful valley surrounded by tall pine trees. Wild flowers grew along the stream, and birds sang in the branches above. But beauty couldn't fill her empty stomach or heal her broken heart. She was completely alone, with no shelter and no way to get food. For 3 days, Maria wandered through the forest, eating wild berries and drinking from streams. She made a shelter from pine branches, but it barely kept out the cold mountain air. At night, she could hear wolves howling in the distance, and she stayed awake with a stick in her hand, ready to defend herself. On the 4th morning, Maria was gathering edible roots when she heard voices. She hid behind a large tree and watched as a group of travelers passed by on a hidden trail. They were merchants heading to the next valley, their horses loaded with goods. Maria's heart raced as she realized they might help her, but she also feared they might recognize her as the witch from San Miguel. Desperation won over fear. Maria stepped out from behind the tree and called to the travelers. The merchant leader, a kind-faced man named Carlos, stopped his horse and looked down at her with concern. Her clothes were torn and dirty, her hair was tangled with leaves, and she looked half-starved. Carlos could see that Maria was in terrible trouble. When he asked what had happened to her, Maria's carefully planned story fell apart. She broke down and told him everything, about the herbs, the healing, and how her own village had cast her out. She expected him to ride away in fear, but Carlos surprised her. The merchant had traveled to many places and seen many things. He had met other women who knew the old ways of healing with plants. In the big cities, such knowledge was valued, not feared. Carlos offered Maria a place in his traveling group, at least until they reached the next town. Grateful beyond words, Maria joined the merchant caravan. The other travelers were suspicious at first, but Maria proved her worth by treating a horse that had gone lame and helping a sick child recover from a fever. Slowly, they began to accept her. For 2 months, Maria traveled with the merchants, learning about the world beyond her mountain village. She saw great cities with stone buildings, markets filled with exotic goods, and people from many different lands. But wherever they went, Maria had to hide her knowledge of healing. Even in the cities, people feared witchcraft. The merchants taught Maria about trade and commerce. She learned how to bargain for goods, how to tell quality materials from poor ones, and how to speak with people from different regions. But more importantly, she learned that not everyone in the world was ruled by fear and superstition. In the city of Valencia, Maria met an old woman named Isabel, who ran a small shop selling herbs and remedies. Isabel had no family and needed help with her business. She offered Maria a job, and for the first time since leaving San Miguel, Maria felt hope growing in her heart. Isabel's shop was tucked away in a narrow alley, far from the main streets where the church authorities might notice it. The old woman had been selling herbal remedies for 30 years, carefully avoiding attention. She taught Maria how to help people without arousing suspicion. Maria learned to be careful about her words. Instead of saying she could cure illnesses, she offered remedies for discomfort. Instead of claiming her herbs had special powers, she simply suggested they might provide relief. It was a delicate dance between helping people and staying safe. Living above Isabel's shop, Maria began to rebuild her life. She swept the floors, organized the herbs, and slowly began to help customers. Her gentle manner and obvious knowledge impressed people, and word spread quietly that the new girl at Isabel's shop really knew what she was doing. But Maria's heart still ached for her lost home. Every night, she dreamed of her grandmother's garden and the mountain village where she had been born. She wondered if the blacksmith's wife was still healthy, if her healing herbs were still growing wild, and if anyone ever thought of her with kindness. Isabel noticed Maria's sadness and tried to cheer her up. She told stories of other women who had been forced to leave their homes because of ignorance and fear. Many had gone on to live good lives in new places. Some had even become famous for their knowledge and wisdom. Winter came to Valencia, bringing cold rains and gray skies. Business at the herb shop slowed down as people stayed indoors. Maria spent long hours reading Isabel's collection of books about plants and healing. She learned new techniques and discovered remedies she had never heard of before. During the quiet winter months, Maria also learned to write. Isabel taught her letters and numbers so she could keep records of their herb, supplies and customer orders. Maria proved to be a quick learner, hungry for knowledge that had been denied to her in the village. As spring arrived, bringing warmth and sunshine back to Valencia, Maria felt stronger and more confident. She had survived her exile and learned valuable skills. But she never forgot the injustice of being cast out from her home. Deep in her heart, she hoped that someday she might have a chance to prove that her intentions had always been good. 3 years passed in Valencia, and Maria had become like a daughter to Isabel. The herb shop thrived under their combined care, and Maria's reputation as a skilled healer spread throughout the city's poorer neighborhoods. She had learned to be discreet, helping people quietly without drawing attention from the church authorities. Maria's days were filled with purpose. In the mornings, she would walk to the market to buy fresh ingredients and gather news from around the region. Afternoons were spent in the shop, mixing remedies and counseling customers about their health problems. Evenings belonged to study, as she continued reading every book about healing that Isabel could find. The old woman had taught Maria much more than herbs and remedies. She learned about human nature, about how fear could make good people do terrible things, and about the importance of patience and forgiveness. Isabel often said that anger was like poison. It hurt the person who carried it more than anyone else. Maria had grown from a frightened exile into a confident young woman. Her hands, once soft from village life, were now skilled at grinding herbs and mixing potions. Her mind, sharp from years of study, could diagnose illnesses that puzzled other healers. But most importantly, her heart had learned compassion for all people, even those who had wronged her. One spring morning, a wealthy merchant named Don Pedro came to the shop with a problem that had puzzled the city's best doctors. His young son had been sick for months with a wasting disease. The boy grew thinner each day despite eating well. The finest physicians in Valencia had tried everything, but nothing helped. Don Pedro was desperate. He had heard whispers about the herb shop in the alley, about a young woman who worked miracles with plants. He didn't care if people called it witchcraft. He only wanted his son to live. With tears in his eyes, he begged Maria to help his dying child. Maria examined the boy carefully. His symptoms reminded her of something she had read in one of Isabel's oldest books. The child needed a rare herb that grew only in the high mountains, the same mountains where Maria had been born. The irony wasn't lost on her. To save this boy's life, she would need to return to the region that had cast her out. Don Pedro offered Maria more money than she had ever seen, enough to buy her own shop and live comfortably for years. But Maria was more concerned about the child's life than the payment. She agreed to make the dangerous journey back to the mountains to find the healing herb. Isabel was worried about Maria's plan. The old woman knew that returning to the mountain region was risky. People there still believed in witchcraft, and they might recognize Maria despite the years that had passed. But she also knew that Maria's conscience wouldn't let her ignore a child's suffering. Maria prepared carefully for her journey. She disguised herself as a traveling merchant's wife, wearing fine clothes that Don Pedro had provided. Her hair was now shorter and styled in the city fashion. Years of good food and safe living had filled out her face, making her look different from the frightened girl who had fled San Miguel. The journey took 2 weeks, traveling with a group of traders who were heading north. As they climbed higher into the mountains, Maria's heart beat faster. She recognized familiar peaks and valleys from her childhood. The air smelled of pine and snow, just as she remembered. When they reached the market town of Santa Rosa, only 1 day's ride from her old village, Maria left the trading group. She told them she was meeting relatives there, but, in truth, she planned to search the high meadows alone for the rare herb she needed. Maria rented a room at a small inn and spent the evening asking casual questions about the surrounding area. She learned that her old village of San Miguel was still there, though several people had died in recent years. The innkeeper mentioned that they had been having trouble with sick livestock, and many children had been born weak and sickly. Early, the next morning, Maria set out on foot toward the high meadows where she hoped to find the mountain herb called angel's breath. It was a dangerous climb, but she had grown strong during her years in Valencia. The morning air was crisp and clean, and eagles soared overhead as she climbed higher into the wilderness. By midday, Maria reached the meadows where her grandmother had once taken her to gather special herbs. The place looked exactly as she remembered, with wildflowers covering the hillsides and crystal-clear streams running down from the snow peaks. She felt a deep peace settling over her heart as she searched through the familiar landscape. It took hours of careful searching, but finally, Maria found what she was looking for. Growing in a sheltered spot near a waterfall was a small patch of angel's breath, its tiny white flowers almost glowing in the afternoon sunlight. She carefully gathered what she needed, taking only enough for the medicine while leaving the rest to continue growing. As Maria prepared to leave the meadow, she heard voices echoing across the valley. A group of people was climbing up the trail toward her location. Her heart raced as she recognized the dialect. They were from San Miguel, her old village. Maria quickly gathered her herbs and looked for a place to hide. From behind a large boulder, Maria watched as a familiar figure came into view. It was Father Rodriguez, the priest who had led the mob that cast her out years ago. But now he looked old and tired, his black robes dusty from the climb. With him were several villagers, including the blacksmith whose wife Maria had once healed. The group seemed to be searching for something in the meadow. Maria could hear fragments of their conversation on the wind. They were talking about sick children in the village, about a disease that their prayers couldn't cure. Someone mentioned the old healing woman who used to live there, the one they had driven away. Maria's hands trembled as she held the precious herbs. These people had destroyed her life, yet here they were, suffering just as she had suffered. Part of her wanted to stay hidden and let them face their troubles alone. But as she listened to them talk about dying children, her grandmother's voice seemed to whisper in her memory. A healer's duty is to all people, even those who have wronged her. Word spread through San Miguel like lightning. The woman they had cast out as a witch had returned to save their dying children. By the time Maria reached the village square, nearly every resident had gathered to see her. Some looked ashamed, others curious, but all were desperate for hope. Maria didn't waste time on speeches or confrontations. She asked to be taken immediately to see the sickest children. The first house belonged to Carmen, the baker's wife, whose 3-year-old son had been fading away for weeks. The little boy lay motionless in his bed, his breathing shallow and his skin pale as paper. Working by candlelight, Maria examined the child with gentle hands. His symptoms matched exactly what she had seen in Don Pedro's son back in Valencia. The rare mountain herb she had gathered would work, but she needed to prepare it correctly. She asked for clean water, honey, and a small clay pot to brew the medicine. The boy's parents watched anxiously as Maria crushed the precious herbs and mixed them with hot water. The brew had to steep for exactly the right amount of time. Too little and it would be weak, too much and it could be dangerous. Maria had learned this delicate timing through years of study with Isabel. While the medicine prepared, Maria went to check on the other sick children. Each house she visited told the same heartbreaking story. Parents who had once called her evil now begged her to save their little ones. Maria felt no satisfaction in their desperation, only sadness that so much suffering could have been prevented. The carpenter's house. She found twin girls barely 2 years old lying listless in their mother's arms. Their father, a man who had carried a torch in the mob that drove her away, now knelt before Maria with tears in his eyes. "Please," he whispered. "I know I have no right to ask, but they're just babies. They never hurt anyone. No child deserves to suffer because of adult mistakes," Maria replied, her voice soft but firm. "I will help them all if I can." Back at the baker's house, the medicine was ready. Maria lifted the little boy in her arms and carefully gave him small sips of the herbal brew. The child was so weak he could barely swallow, but Maria was patient, giving him tiny amounts at a time until he had taken the full dose. The entire village seemed to hold its breath as they waited. Maria explained that the medicine would take time to work, perhaps hours, maybe a full day. She prepared doses for all the other sick children, moving from house to house throughout the night with villagers following her like shadows. Father Rodriguez walked beside her, carrying her medicine bag like a humble servant. The proud priest, who had once condemned her, now helped her in any way he could. "I spent years preaching about miracles," he said quietly, "but I was too blind to recognize one when it lived among us." As dawn broke over the mountains, something wonderful began to happen. The baker's son, who had been dying just hours before, opened his eyes and asked for water. His mother screamed with joy, calling for her neighbors to come and see. The child's color was returning and his breathing was stronger. One by one, the other children began to improve. The carpenter's twin girls sat up and smiled at their parents. A baby who hadn't eaten in days began nursing again. Another child, who had been too weak to speak, called out for her mother. The village that had been shrouded in grief suddenly exploded with celebration, but Maria's work wasn't finished. She knew that the children would need continued care to fully recover, and she began teaching the villagers how to prepare simple herbal remedies for common illnesses. She showed mothers which plants could reduce fevers, which could settle upset stomachs, and which could help children sleep when they were troubled. The village women gathered around Maria like students around a beloved teacher. They asked endless questions about healing herbs, about how to recognize symptoms, about when to use different remedies. Maria patiently shared everything she had learned, holding nothing back, despite how these same people had treated her. News of the miraculous healing spread to neighboring villages. People began arriving in San Miguel, some seeking cures for their own sick family members, others simply wanting to see the woman who had returned good for evil. Maria helped everyone she could, never turning anyone away. Don Pedro, the wealthy merchant from Valencia, arrived 3 days later with his sick son. He had followed Maria's trail when she disappeared from the city, worried that something had happened to her. When he saw what she was doing in San Miguel, he understood why she had risked everything to return to the mountains. Maria treated Don Pedro's son with the same care she had shown the village children. The boy recovered quickly, just as the others had. Don Pedro was amazed not just by Maria's healing skill, but by her compassion for people who had wronged her. He offered to pay her generously and take her back to Valencia, where she would be safe and honored. But Maria had found something in San Miguel that she couldn't find anywhere else: the chance to transform hatred into love, fear into understanding. The village that had cast her out was learning to see past their superstitions. Children who had been dying were now playing in the streets. Former enemies were becoming grateful friends. Father Rodriguez stood before his congregation the following Sunday and delivered a sermon unlike any he had given before. He spoke about judging others, about the danger of fear, and about the young woman who had shown them all what true Christianity looked like. He publicly apologized to Maria for the terrible wrong he had done her. The villagers voted unanimously to ask Maria to stay and become their official healer. They offered to rebuild her grandmother's old cottage, to give her the best land in the valley, and to honor her for as long as they lived. But Maria had learned that forgiveness was not about receiving apologies. It was about freeing her own heart from the poison of resentment. She had proven that kindness was stronger than cruelty, that healing could overcome hatred, and that love was the most powerful magic of all. The scared young woman who had fled into the night had returned as a confident healer who could face any challenge. But her greatest victory was not in the herbs she had gathered or the children she had saved. It was in the transformation of an entire community's heart. Maria's heart pounded as she crouched behind the boulder, watching the villagers from San Miguel search desperately through the mountain meadow. Father Rodriguez looked frail and defeated, nothing like the powerful man who had condemned her years ago. The blacksmith was crying openly as he spoke about his youngest daughter, who had been born sickly and was now dying. The conversation Maria overheard broke her heart. A strange illness had struck the village's children over the past year. 5 babies had already died, and 3 more were close to death. The village healer, an old man named Miguel, had passed away during the winter, leaving no one with knowledge of herbal medicine. Maria learned that the villagers had been searching the mountains for weeks looking for anyone who might help them. They had heard stories about a miraculous herb that could cure wasting sickness in children, but none of them knew what it looked like or where to find it. They were searching blindly, driven by desperation and love for their dying children. She listened. Maria realized that the same rare herb she had just gathered for Don Pedro's son could also save the children of San Miguel. The irony was overwhelming. She held in her hands the cure for the village that had cast her out as a witch. She had enough of the herb to help both the wealthy merchant's child and the poor village children. Father Rodriguez suddenly sat down, heavily on a rock, his face gray with exhaustion. He was an old man now, and the climb had been too much for him. The blacksmith and the other villagers gathered around him with concern. Maria could see that they were all exhausted and hopeless, ready to give up their search. "We've looked everywhere," the blacksmith said, his voice breaking. "God forgive us, but maybe we should have listened to old Maria's granddaughter years ago. Maybe she really was trying to help people, not harm them." Father Rodriguez nodded slowly, his pride finally broken by years of seeing his prayers fail while children died. "I was so afraid of things I didn't understand," he admitted. "Perhaps we made a terrible mistake. That young woman never hurt anyone. She only tried to heal the sick." Maria felt tears streaming down her face as she heard these words. For years, she had dreamed of hearing the villagers admit they had been wrong about her. But now that the moment had come, she felt no joy in their suffering. She only felt pity for people who were learning too late the cost of their fear and ignorance. The group of villagers began to pack up their things, preparing for the long, sad journey back to their village. They had failed to find help, and more children would die because of their failure. Maria watched them slowly getting ready to leave, and she knew she faced the most important decision of her life. She could stay hidden and let them go. She could return to Valencia with the herb and heal only Don Pedro's son, living safely and comfortably while the village children died. No one would ever know, and she would be perfectly justified in her choice. These people had destroyed her life and shown her no mercy. But as Maria looked at the herb in her hands, she heard her grandmother's voice again. The gift of healing comes with a great responsibility. It must never be used for revenge, only for love. Her grandmother had taught her that a true healer serves life itself, not personal feelings or past hurts. Taking a deep breath, Maria stood up from behind the boulder. Her hands shook as she stepped into view of the villagers. For a moment, nobody moved. The villagers stared at her in shock, trying to understand what they were seeing. Father Rodriguez's eyes widened in recognition and fear. "Please don't be afraid," Maria said softly, her voice carrying across the meadow. "I heard you talking about sick children. I think I can help them." The blacksmith was the first to find his voice. "Maria? Little Maria who used to live at the edge of town. But we thought you were..." He couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't say the word witch while looking into her kind, familiar face. "I am the same person I always was," Maria replied gently. "I never practiced witchcraft. I only used the healing herbs my grandmother taught me about, the same knowledge that could save your children now." Father Rodriguez struggled to his feet, his face pale with shock and shame. "You have every right to hate us," he said quietly. "We treated you terribly. We were wrong about you, and our fear made us cruel. Why would you want to help us now?" Maria held up the precious herbs she had gathered. "Because children are dying," she said simply, "and because this is what my grandmother would have wanted me to do. She taught me that healing knows no boundaries, holds no grudges, and serves only life itself." The villagers gathered around Maria, hardly believing that the woman they had cast out as a witch had returned to help them in their darkest hour. Some wept with shame at how they had treated her. Others fell to their knees begging her forgiveness. But Maria was already thinking about the sick children waiting in the village below. "There's no time for apologies now," she told them. "We need to get back to the village quickly. These herbs must be prepared properly, and every hour counts when children are dying." The journey back to San Miguel took on a sense of urgency. The villagers who had climbed slowly and sadly up the mountain now hurried down the trail, hope giving strength to their tired legs. Maria found herself surrounded by people who had once feared her, now looking to her as their only chance for salvation. As they descended toward the village, Maria felt a strange mixture of emotions. She was returning to the place that had rejected her, but now she came as a healer, not an exile. The scared young woman who had fled in the night had grown into someone strong enough to face her past and transform it through compassion. The sun was setting behind the familiar mountains as San Miguel came into view. Maria saw her old cottage, now occupied by another family. She saw the church where Father Rodriguez had preached against her. She saw the square where the mob had gathered to cast her out. But instead of anger or sadness, she felt only determination to save the innocent children who were suffering. Maria decided to stay in San Miguel for 3 months to ensure the children's complete recovery and to train several village women in basic herbal healing. She established a small clinic in the building that had once been used to store grain, transforming it into a place of hope and healing. Every morning, Maria would walk through the village that had once cast her out, now greeted with smiles and blessings from every person she met. Children ran to her with flowers they had picked, and mothers stopped her on the street to show how healthy their little ones had become. The transformation was so complete it seemed like a dream. The carpenter, whose twin girls Maria had saved, spent weeks rebuilding her grandmother's old cottage without being asked. Other villagers contributed furniture, cooking pots, and warm blankets. They planted a new garden, with all the healing herbs Maria recommended, creating a living pharmacy for future generations. Father Rodriguez worked alongside Maria, learning to see God's work in the healing power of plants rather than fearing it as evil magic. He began incorporating Maria's teachings into his sermons, speaking about how divine gifts could come through human knowledge and compassion. The church that had once condemned herbalism now blessed it. Young women from the village begged Maria to teach them everything she knew. She selected 5 of the brightest and most caring girls to train as healing assistants. These students learned not just about herbs and remedies, but about the importance of treating people with dignity and respect regardless of their status or past mistakes. Maria's reputation spread far beyond the mountain region. Visitors came from distant cities, including several learned doctors who wanted to study her methods. Some were skeptical at first, but they couldn't argue with her results. Several invited her to teach at universities, offering her wealth and fame in the academic world. But the most important visitor was Isabel, the old woman who had taken Maria in during her exile. Despite her age and the difficult journey, Isabel traveled from Valencia to see what had happened to her adopted daughter. When she saw the thriving clinic and the transformed village, tears of joy streamed down her weathered face. "You have become everything I hoped you would be," Isabel told Maria as they sat together in the garden behind the cottage. "But more than that, you have proven that the greatest healing comes not from herbs or potions, but from forgiveness and love." Isabel spent a month in San Miguel, working alongside Maria and sharing her own knowledge with the village women. The Bao, 2 healers, young and old, created a complete guide to mountain herbs that would serve the region for generations to come. They documented every plant, its uses, proper preparation methods, and potential dangers. As autumn approached, Maria faced another difficult decision. Isabel was getting older and needed help managing her shop in Valencia. The village of San Miguel was now safe, with trained healers to care for the people. Don Pedro continued to send messages offering her opportunities in the wider world. She could go anywhere, do anything she wanted. The villagers held a great feast to honor Maria before she made her choice. They presented her with gifts, a beautiful cloak embroidered with healing symbols, a set of the finest herb-gathering tools, and a leather-bound book where they had written every story of her kindness and healing. But the greatest gift was seeing the healthy, happy children playing around the bonfire. The blacksmith's wife, the first person Maria had ever healed, stood up to speak for the entire village. With a voice full of emotion, she told the story of how Maria's grandmother had once saved her own mother's life, how Maria herself had healed her years ago, and how Maria had now returned to save all their children. "We cast you out in fear and ignorance," the woman said, looking directly at Maria, "but you returned with love and wisdom. You have shown us that true strength lies not in revenge but in compassion. Whatever you choose to do with your life, know that you will always be remembered here as an angel, not a witch." Father Rodriguez added his own testimony, admitting publicly how wrong he had been and how much Maria's example had changed his understanding of faith and healing. The entire village then knelt and asked for her blessing, a complete reversal of the scene from years before when they had driven her away. Maria chose to return to Valencia with Isabel, but she promised to visit San Miguel every year to check on the people and continue training new healers. She established a tradition where young women from the mountain villages could come to Valencia to study advanced healing techniques, then return to serve their own communities. Back in Valencia, Maria opened a larger healing center that served people from all walks of life. Her story had spread throughout the region, and people traveled great distances to seek treatment from the woman who had forgiven her enemies and transformed hatred into love. But Maria never forgot the lessons she had learned in the mountains. The healing center became famous not just for its medical success but for its philosophy of treating all people equally. Rich merchants received the same care as poor farmers. Former enemies were welcomed alongside loyal friends. Maria taught her students that true healing required treating the whole person, body, mind, and spirit. Don Pedro became one of Maria's greatest supporters, funding the healing center and helping to spread her reputation among the wealthy and powerful. His son, now completely healthy, often visited to help with the younger patients. The boy had been so inspired by Maria's kindness that he decided to study medicine himself. Isabel lived for 5 more years, working alongside Maria and watching with pride as her protégé became one of the most respected healers in the region. When the old woman finally passed away peacefully in her sleep, she left everything to Maria, including a letter that revealed a secret she had kept for decades. Isabel had once been cast out of her own village for practicing herbal healing, just like Maria. She had spent her entire life proving that knowledge and compassion were stronger than fear and ignorance. In Maria, she had found not just a student, but a kindred spirit who would carry on the work of healing and forgiveness. Years passed, and Maria's influence spread far beyond her healing center. She wrote books about herbal medicine that were studied in universities across Europe. She trained dozens of healers who went on to establish their own centers in distant cities. Most importantly, she proved that women could be scholars and healers without being feared as witches. The village of San Miguel became a place of pilgrimage for people seeking both physical healing and spiritual renewal. Visitors came to see where the famous healer had transformed a community through forgiveness. The children Maria had saved grew up to become village leaders, always remembering the woman who had shown them that kindness was the greatest power in the world. Maria never married, but she had hundreds of spiritual children, the students she trained, the patients she healed, and the communities she transformed. Her legacy lived on through every person who chose compassion over revenge, understanding over fear, and love over hatred. When Maria grew old, she returned to San Miguel one final time. The village had prospered under the care of the healers she had trained. The children she had saved were now parents themselves, teaching their own children about the herbs and remedies that could heal both body and soul. Maria passed away peacefully in her grandmother's cottage, surrounded by the people who had once cast her out but had learned to love her. Father Rodriguez, now very old himself, spoke at her funeral about the miracle of transformation he had witnessed. He said that Maria had taught him the true meaning of resurrection, not just rising from the dead, but rising above hatred to find love. The villagers built a statue of Maria in the town square, but not as the young woman who had fled in fear. Instead, they portrayed her as she had returned, confident, compassionate, and carrying the herbs that had saved their children. The inscription read, "Maria Elena, healer of bodies and hearts, she returned good for evil and taught us all how to love." Her healing center in Valencia continued for generations, run by her students and their students. The methods she developed saved countless lives, and her philosophy of compassionate healing became the foundation for modern medical ethics. But perhaps her greatest achievement was proving that even the deepest wounds of injustice could be healed through forgiveness. The world had called her a witch, but Maria had shown them what a true miracle looked like. Not magic or supernatural powers, but the very human ability to transform hatred into love, fear into understanding, and enemies into friends. Her kindness had indeed shocked the world, but more importantly, it had changed it forever. In the end, Maria's story became legend, told and retold across the centuries. It reminded people that the greatest power is not the ability to destroy one's enemies, but the wisdom to transform them into allies. She had proven that one person's choice to respond with love instead of revenge could change not just individual hearts but entire communities and generations to come.